So, Stefan, you've been working for over 30 years on your theory of love.
Yes, I have. And so at times it was a lonely journey, to be honest. Uh, but I got a lot of support from friends and colleagues, and that kind of kept me going. And really, what I've been doing, Serge, is, and by the way, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity. What I've been doing is um, looking at the implications and the applications of this idea. Uh, I spent almost a year with a couple of graduate students researching everything we could to make sure that I wasn't duplicating something that was already out there and thinking that I have something new, because I thought it was quite an important revelation in a sense, insight into uh, our nature. So that is what my work has been. Uh, Looked at its implication and application, for instance, to child development, and out of that parenting, and then out of that the whole educational system. Uh, then spent more than a couple of years, I would say maybe even as much as 5 years, putting together a psychotherapy training, because it clearly for me had tremendous implications for psychotherapeutic intervention. I actually think on some level people come to psychotherapy to buy 45 minutes of unconditional love. Where else can you sit and be accepted and be supported and not made wrong and not judged and be listened to proactively? Which to me, in terms of my theory, these are all aspects of my theory of love as nourishment. So people come for 45 minutes, pay to be nourished with this love. Are you going
So,
to?
so I
Yeah.
want to I want to highlight this, that sense of
Hmm.
love is nourishment is the
Yes.
big point. And
Yes.
as you point out in talks we've had, it's not a metaphor, it's not an as if, but it's something that is literal.
Literally true. Literally true. Um, it wasn't until Fredrickson published her book Love 2.0 that you could say some level of research was applied to the theory indirectly, because it doesn't seem like she was aware of my work or my concept that love is nourishment like air, food, and water, literally. And again, we know that Eric Fromm, in his Art of Loving in the 50s, wrote, human beings are starved for love. But I'm sure we all figured that it's figuratively. It's not meant literally. But in her book, she said that she did 8-year research with loving kindness meditation, and her conclusion was basically my hypothesis, that love is nourishment like air, food, and water. So since then, I have felt a little less alone, uh, and uh, and when we really look around, we have many things that can be brought in to also substantiate this idea. For instance, we have something called psychosocial dwarfism. A lack of growth hormones is the way it was identified, why kids were small of stature and their brains didn't develop fully. But then it turned out, looking a little closer, that most of these children, not all, most of them came from emotionally barren homes where they weren't being loved. And when they took them out of those homes, many of these children in a more loving environment literally started to grow physically, and their brain started to develop. So basically the same thing that happens when you have malnourished children, and then you start to give them the right amount of nourishment, food, water, etc., along with love. Then we have another component we can look at, and that's tissue regeneration. Um, we have studies with what we would call cell activation, wound healing. And in these studies, we also find that our environment and the way we behave and the way people behave towards us uh, helps. And then of course with the importance of support uh, uh, in terms of cancer survival. Now, when we use the word support, but what does it mean when people have a large loving community around them? Aren't they getting love? So maybe one of the first things that I should do here is just to talk a little bit about uh, uh, the difference between the way I use love as nourishment and probably the way most people are used to hearing it, which is in the romantic context. So when we look at the physiology of romance, basically it's a biological energy. It's involuntarily generated. We're attracted to somebody. There is desire, passion, and it's a procreative energy, but it doesn't nourish. It what it does is generates dopamine, adrenaline, right? We call it the adrenaline rush. It's driven by pheromones. So that is what I call the physiology of romance, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the physiology of nurturing love. Now, that again by definition is a life-sustaining energy, and there are things we know about orphanages and infants, crib death, that again point to in Romania, for instance, when the Ceausescu communist regime fell, they had tons. I mean, every small town almost had an orphanage because he encouraged people to have children. He wanted to populate the country, make it a big population, powerful country. So, and he said he will take care of the children. So people had children that they couldn't actually support. They went into these orphanages, and one of the things that they found when relief services and these people kind of came in to help Romania during that period is there was a very high rate of crib death. And they couldn't figure out why. They thought, well, maybe they're killing the kids, or they're doing something. So they put in cameras to see if maybe at night they're coming around with pillows, or what are they doing. And no, they found that the caretakers were changing them. They were clean, they were being fed, and they were dying. And the
Yes.
only thing they could figure out is what they weren't being held.
Yeah.
They weren't
So
being loved. Yes, sir.
so here clearly by its absence we
Mm-hmm.
see the nurturing role can that love can have,
Yeah.
but you're making a big distinction between romantic love, attraction, versus nurturing love.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, we have in the Greek we have familial and we have eros. We have
Hmm.
kind of the distinction, and uh, same thing here. I mean, what happens really is that when we behave lovingly with people and they behave lovingly with us, and that list of behaviors can be quite long. But what it does is it generates a whole different set of chemicals and hormones, as opposed to adrenaline, dopamine, pheromones. What we get is oxytocin and endorphins, vasopressin, and this is done by conscious awareness. Our loving behavior is conscious. It's not automatic the way it may be instinctual, but it's not automatic. And I mean, we even call oxytocin the love hormone now.
Hmm.
Um, so they nourish our immune system and our growth hormones and wound healing, and from epigenetics we know that it has a lot to do with longevity, again, cancer survival. So when we start to put the whole picture together, it does start looking like there is something going on when we're in an environment of when we're receiving love, that we're being nourished. And by the way, we do say mother's love nourishes. But again, we probably think of it more figuratively rather than literally. But
Right, right. But so you're saying that unlike romantic love, nourishing love is something that may be instinctive, but is actually a choice, is a mindful decision.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that mindfulness needs to come from ourselves. So when you look at this as a hypothesis or a truth, and then you begin to work with this concept, what do we know about nourishment? Well, I have a couple of grandchildren, and I will tell you the cutest thing to watch when they're little is trying to hold a cup, trying to learn how to use a knife and a fork. They go and they pull open the refrigerator when they're 2 years old to grab something, right? We actually teach human beings how to nourish themselves, how to become self-sufficient with nourishment. And even though we may talk about education and a career, but what is education and a career about? Bottom line, well, it's about making money so that you can feed yourself. You can become independent. You get money, you buy money, you cook your own food, and you eat your own food. As parents, we have done our job. We have a self-sufficient human being taking care of what? Well, number one, their nourishment needs. So by implication, when do we ever teach a human being to love themselves? And the answer is never. It's actually the opposite. We 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 have, and I think it has goes back 2 million years, and I don't want to get into the anthropological development of humanity. But we don't like when people are selfish, self-centered, egotistical. And when I teach and I use that word self-love, people have a resistance to that word. It kind of gives people a bad taste in their mouth. And the way I work around that is I ask them, when you're hungry, do you go to the refrigerator and get yourself something to eat? They look at me. It's not a trick question. It's just straightforward. And well, of course, of course. Well, yeah, you do, because you're the only one who knows when you're hungry, and you've been taught how to be self-sufficient. Take care of that particular need. What does somebody who feels the need for love do? What refrigerator can they go to? There isn't any. What if people around them have rejected them, or they feel that they have been rejected? Where do you go for this nourishment? And the answer is, we need to teach human beings, if we accept this as a fact that love is nourishment, like air food, we have to teach human beings to love themselves. So
Mm-hmm.
I started working with that concept, and I will tell you, Serge, um, the most incredible thing initially, when I would say to somebody, well, you deserve love, and you deserve it unconditionally for absolutely no reason, they would break down and start crying. And the amount of pain that we carry around, even when we come from more loving homes, is quite a bit, because we're taught not to love ourselves. It's a sin. And families move from being unconditional, which again, if we understand human development, that must be our instinctual approach to an infant, without knowing we're nourishing them because we're being so loving and unconditional with them. And these family environments morph, we call it terrible twos. They morph into conditional, more and more and more conditional, because we have a mind of our own and a will of our own, and not all children are compliant. And whatever and whoever they are, parents are tired, they don't love themselves, they don't have a good relationship with each other, on and on. They have problems at work. And since we don't know how important it is to be loving towards a child unconditionally, even when we're upset and angry with them, uh, we behave conditionally. And those instances those instances are incredibly painful. I'm going to give you a couple of other things. I see that you would
I
like to
wanted to, I
ask
want
me. Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to say, as we're coming there, so this is the background
Hmm.
of how people come to therapy in lots of ways to
Hmm.
address this.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how you use this framework in therapy, and you've alluded to something of telling somebody that they have the right to be loved.
Hmm.
But just could you maybe give a little bit, flesh out a little bit more of how this might color your approach to therapy?
Well, the first thing when somebody comes to me, because I'm already looking and I've been working with this for 30 years, so I have tremendous amount of evidence for the fact that this is a fundamental cause of the symptoms. The symptoms are many: depression, anxiety, anger, uh, self-destructive behavior, addictions. It goes on, and I look at someone and I assume that by starting the process with love, that it will give me a window into a lot of things that happen. So one of the first things I do when they come to me, besides explaining that love is nourishment, and that uh, uh, therefore, what that means is that you first and foremost need to learn to love yourself, nourish yourself just like you do with air, food, and water. And that, and as soon as they hear that, and some stuff immediately, stuff comes up about their mother or their father, or things like that. That
So in a way, it's as if they're coming and you say, okay, so what you're talking about are symptoms, and the
right,
underlying condition is you're malnourished. Not
absolutely.
necessarily malnourished in terms of food, but in terms of love.
Absolutely. And so let's just pause there for 1 second, and let's take a look at the human organism, because like Carl Rogers says, the one thing we can do is trust our experience.
Hmm.
uh, so it takes our organism a couple of days or more to begin to signal us that there is pain when food and water are absent.
Hmm.
We start to, right, the painful. I founded an organization called Impact on Hunger many years ago, and I lived with hunger and starvation 24/7 for 8 years. So it takes the body about 30 seconds to a minute to signal that there's a lack of oxygen. Pain. Do you know how long it takes the body, and we're talking about somatic mindfulness, how long it takes the body to signal that there is a lack of love, there's a deprivation of love?
Tell me.
What? A nanosecond? A second? So that has to tell us how important, how essential this is, because we are so sensitive to it.
No, so just let's check a little bit. When you say a deprivation of love, are you talking about absence of love, or are you talking about hostility or being ignored, or just what do you mean by?
Well, hostility, being ignored. Since we're not taught to love ourselves, that's kind of
Hmm.
where we come from, and we grow up in a conditional environment, which, if it takes a second for our bodies to signal that we're without love, uh, in a conditional environment, we're going to get those signals quite often, even in a 1 day period. uh, so all of those things, it's like a switch. We're very loving when we're happy and content with life and what the child or the other person is doing. But the minute we don't like it, the minute for some reason it disappoints us, upsets us, they say something, they do something, we literally turn the switch off. And that's
Okay,
my analogy. Turn
okay,
the switch
so
on, turn the switch off, and we sense it.
so what you're talking about is essentially a typical scene
Right.
of a parent seems to be very connected to the child, very loving, the child does something that the parent objects to, and suddenly there is a coldness in the air or something,
Yes.
and you have that moment of rupture and attunement,
Yes.
and that. So what you're talking about is we're highly sensitive to the
I
rupture and attunement.
absolutely.
I just wanted to clarify what you
Right.
meant by how
Yes.
quickly we respond to lack of love, and to specifically what you mean by that.
Yeah. And you're absolutely correct. You're framing it out and using words that I think a lot of people will understand. But I'm talking about, see, we can use the word attunement, but what causes that rupture in the attunement?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is why I feel this is one of the most fundamental things, and it's missing. And so how can we build on when the foundation and the fundamental thing isn't even recognized, acknowledged, as a thing? Uh, uh, Another analogy I think that's very good for your audience is, for instance, sound. We don't see sound. We don't see sound. It's an intentioned energy. We generate it, and somehow, we never understood until the machinery came around, somehow the other person was able to sense this energy and make sense of this energy. Well, if you think about love, yes, we can't see it, but it's the same. It's an intentioned energy, and somehow we're able to sense it. We have a visceral, physical reaction. Somebody just smiles, a stranger can smile at you, kind of feels nice. We sense it. It's a little bit of love. It's not a great amount of love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are foods that deliver a tremendous amount of nutritious energy, and there are some foods that deliver very little, or they may even be unhealthy foods, kind of like unhealthy behaviors towards ourselves, that turning that switch off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Good. So,
yeah.
so that I follow you there. So just let's talk a little bit about then what you do
How?
next in therapy.
Right,
So
right.
first we've talked about that sense of saying, okay, there's a problem about the nourishment, the lack of love, and
hmm
you say people come back and say, oh yeah, it reminds me of this or that.
hmm
Yeah.
Right. And so I look at that and I build with that. And it's again incredible how receptive people are, how almost relieved they are, like they can breathe the fact that they can actually talk about love that's been missing in their life. And of course missing because they've never been taught how to love themselves, and they're constantly looking into their environment, for this love. Uh, so one of the things I say to them is, let's make a list of your lovable qualities. What are the things that you really like about yourself? Well, there isn't anything. There isn't anything. Or they struggle with writing down 2, 3 things. Or the whole idea makes them so uncomfortable that they have to, and it's kind of like, and I try not to pull too many out at the beginning because I want them to think about. I tell them, all right, take your 3 lovable qualities and show it to some friends or family. See if you're right. Maybe you put something down that they don't perceive, or maybe you forgot some, and then they come back the week later, and all of a sudden they got a list, 15 long, and they never thought that their mother or father or a sibling or a spouse had positive thoughts about them, about their lovable qualities. So what I work on initially very much is this awareness of worthiness, your lovable qualities. And by the way, I'm very averse to using substitute words, because it means it's meaningless to a client. They're not coming here to fix their attachment issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're coming here because they don't feel loved. They're struggling, and then whatever other things. Well, I'm having a problem with this. It almost always goes back to this sense of self, this lack of sensing one's self-worth, self-esteem, inability to care about themselves, self-care, self-support. These are the things that are missing. And what's underneath this is self-love.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Self-love.
So what I'm hearing is that essentially, even aside from any intervention, the major thing is if you think in terms of love and you introduce that head on to the client, you establish a connection with the fundamental problem.
Yes. Yes. So I mean, let me give you an example. I had a client today, and the client came uh, uh, maybe a month and a half ago, and basically was saying that even though she loves her husband, she's ready to get out of the relationship. And of course, you know, that's something that you know, as a therapist, you want to help this person avoid that, especially if you actually can verbalize feelings for this person. And still, we started with the lovable qualities, and then maybe what are some of you not so lovable, and to show it to people. And she did, and she got, you know, her list kind of grew. Uh, and uh, One of the things that people get to understand, because we have this list of lovable and unlovable qualities, understanding that this nurtures and nourishes you, this is what you need, this makes you feel deprived of, and it produces anxiety and all other, like disrespect. So, okay, and she had to go away for like about 3 weeks. Okay, the kids went to camp and a trip and everything like that, and there was a very serious what she considered kind of a serious disrespect issue with her husband and money. That he was really monitoring and supervising and questioning uh, uh, her spending habits or what she was spending on. So the first thing we figured out a while ago is, so give him a list of all the things you always, you know, you have to pay for school, you have to pay for this, you have to make a list, so that if that shows up on his radar, he knows that's a monthly or weekly kind of expense, and that will help him. So, you know, she did that, but it didn't really stop. So she uh, confronted him, and she said, look, I love you and I want to be in this relationship, but not this way, because it makes me feel like a child. It, you know, it's not comfortable. And, you know, she used a number of things. What she really did is she took responsibility for getting the respect that she felt she
Yeah.
wasn't getting and needed. And she came in today and she told me the whole story, and he woke up. He just, I'm so sorry. I never realized that you know, kind of felt that way. Now, she has not been trained how to communicate, because I do that. And the context of every communication is, I know that you love me and you know that I love you. And when you don't preface every, especially problems, obviously, with that, then I teach them that the problem takes over the whole relationship. And you dropped out the most important piece, which is the context. You have to start with that, because that will make somebody open up and listen to what you have to say. Otherwise, you're really saying, I don't love you, you don't love me, and da-da-da-da-da about the checkbook. So she started with that, and he was able to hear her. And yeah, I mean, they work. I mean, I was so proud of her, you
Yeah, yeah,
know.
yeah.
And
So what I'm hearing from this is that one is there was some work you did with her in order to see herself as worthy of love,
mhm,
and that came from her paying attention to what she thought other people might find lovable on her,
mhm,
but also in interacting with friends, so that she was able to actually get a better understanding of what the relationship was with these friends and saw the love that might not have been visible to her before.
mhm,
And from that place of strengthening her sense of being lovable,
mhm,
she was able to apply the principle of confronting in a loving way.
mhm,
That is, first, in a way, reassuring the other person that there's love,
mhm.
and then going to the issue and that in itself helped the resolution of the issue.
It seems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes. I mean, you're framing it absolutely correctly. Thank you. Uh, yeah. And now, when people hear unconditional, this is another kind of red flag for people. Some people say it's impossible. Well, if you've never been in an unconditional relationship, like 99.9% of people haven't, even the most loving relationships are conditional to some degree, then of course it would be normal, to think that it was impossible. What I explain to people is that needs to be the goal. It's a continuum from totally conditional to totally unconditional is a continuum. Most of us are probably somewhere in the middle of this, but if you don't set that as your goal, you will never begin to even move in that direction. That has to be the vision. That has to be the goal. And again, mothers are capable and sometimes fathers of being unconditional. So clearly we have it in us. We have the capacity to be unconditional, but it's really trained out of us. And especially as we're defending ourselves constantly from a conditional environment.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the ways we do it is by being conditional back. You
Right.
hurt my feelings, well, then I'll distance myself. And I had one.
So hold on. I just want to
Yeah,
check. We're
sorry.
coming to the end. I just want to check
Okay.
if this was a good place to end, or if you want to add something before we do.
Yeah, I would love to, if it's okay
Yeah,
with you.
sure, sure.
I had a graduate student who was interning with me for almost a year. She was waiting to be accepted into a PhD program, which she was. And I'm happy to say a lot of my interns get accepted, which I'm very happy for them and kind of proud of myself. But she had just gotten married. And she was very interested in and curious and kind of eager to learn this theory. She was in the field of psychology, obviously, and so she was interested in learning. So one day I said to her, "What do you do when you get angry?" She says, "Well, sometimes I get loud, but most of the time I just walk away, walk into the other room." So I said, "Well, you know that love is nourishment, and you know that the reason the two of you got married was because you were both looking for an unconditional relationship, which you haven't had since infancy. So the adrenaline and dopamine might have brought you together, but what really cemented the deal was that you worked so hard in staying in this sexually interesting relationship, plus you liked each other's personality, etc., that you behaved actually unconditionally. You were appreciative, you were acknowledging, encouraging, you were patient with each other. You were as unconditional as people could be during the dating, during the engagement, in a honeymoon period, etc. That's why you came together. He needs your love and you need his love. And so when you feel he's not being loving, he says the wrong things, then you walk away. But the fact is, he needs your love. So what I want you to do the next time you have an upset is go up to him, take his hand, and say, I'm very upset right now because of what you said, but I really would like to, talk about it and see if we can resolve it. Well, she came back the next day. She tried to speak. She couldn't. She sat down. She started to cry. And
Mm.
even as I say it, I kind of feel it. And she said, "Oh my God, it completely changed what normally happens. I got upset, but instead of walking away, and of course, initially, I'm sorry, when I said this, I said, I can't do that. I can't do that when I'm angry to go over and actually touch him." And I said, "Well, you want to make it an experiment. You want to be a psychologist, do the experiment, see what happens." So she said, I went over there and I touched him and we talked and we both cried and it was so silly. And so this is the thing I wanted to do, Serge. is to just, because we started to talk about conditional and unconditional, and what I wanted to do is just give a definition, because most people basically, like I said, have this sense of it's not something that uh, we can attain. That it's not something we can attain. So I have a definition. Conditional love, which is our present state. This is where we are. This is where I am, by the way. I'm I'm not going to profess to be an unconditional human being. Uh, and it what it is giving and accepting loving energy only when you are pleased with someone's behavior, rather than under any and all circumstances. So when we're upset, it's not only that we don't give it, but we don't want to receive it. We're in a rejecting mode. Don't talk to me, don't touch me, don't da 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 da. Conditional. The goal is unconditional behavior, consciously, consistently giving, accepting loving energy, even under painful, upsetting, and disappointing circumstances. And that is the goal. That is what we want to work towards.
So I want to tweak a little bit. I love what you said, especially as it came after the example of that intern of yours, which
Mm-hmm.
was a very beautiful example. And I want to tweak it a little bit because I'm among the people who are a bit uncomfortable about the concept of totally unconditional love as some kind of a totally, superhuman ideal. And
Right.
and 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 I think we're not far apart in terms of how we think, but a tweak of language for me would be to take what you said as say that there is a bit of a leap of faith there, or a Pascalian wager for instance, to take the case of your intern, her normal default behavior when she's upset is to go away, withhold love.
Right.
And what you're telling her is to say, look, it may not work, but try it, because if
Mm-hmm.
it works, it's going to be so good that it's worth the effort. And
Okay.
so in that
I like that.
sense, you don't even have to buy into the fact that there is such a thing as unconditional love. You bypass the discussion, but you have the pragmatic opportunity to see, isn't it worth it?
Yes. I love it. I love the way you framed it. And by the way, what comes up for people, I don't know if you know this, but in 2014, the number one Googled search phrase
Mm-hmm.
was "What is love?" Now, on the one hand, everybody thinks they know what love is,
Right.
but look at how many people, what are they really saying when they're saying what is love? And the way I interpret it is, why can't I get it? Why don't I have any control over this thing that I seem to need so much? And of course, the answer is loving yourself, which of course is written everywhere. It's been written 5 million times that you have to love yourself before you can love another person. But now the question comes up, how? How do you love yourself? And my answer to that is, we know how to love a best friend. That's why they're a best friend. Just be your own best friend
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and start paying attention to your behavior towards yourself. Is it loving? Is it unloving? Is it loving? If you're not critical of your best friend, why be critical of yourself? If you're not impatient with your best friend, why be impatient with yourself? If you encourage your best friend, try encouraging yourself. So that may be a little bit of that. That's a how-to. How do I love myself?
Great.
Become your own best friend, right?
Great.
uh, the other part of the whole equation here is that when we stop being dependent on others, it's much easier to accept their flaws. It's much easier not to get upset when they do something unloving, when they turn off the light switch, because they will do it and we will do it. But when we have learned to love ourselves, or we're on that path of learning to love ourselves, it's so much easier to accept the faults and flaws of other people, and then to actually go to them and say, this is unacceptable behavior. I know you love me, and I know you didn't do it on purpose. This is the hard one. I know you didn't do it on purpose. This is the hard one,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's an adult. So of course they do everything consciously and on purpose. And the fact is zero, right? It's eyes open, asleep.
Right,
That's
right, right.
that's what we are, eyes open, asleep. So, and when they start to understand that when people do unloving things, it's usually a kind of automatic behavior. It's not really conscious. So then they can say, "I know you love me. I know you didn't do it on purpose to hurt my feelings. Totally unacceptable. Here are the consequences. The next time, we'll sleep in separate rooms for a couple of days." So you can think about how you value this relationship, and you can say it lovingly, warmly.
Right.
So,
Thanks,
but
Stefan.
I had fun. I love your reinterpretation, what I'm saying, because it's absolutely, you're taking what I'm saying and you're putting it. Can I have one last word?
Sure.
Really? Okay. So again, just going back to establishing love being nourishment, because I think that's where the skeptics come in. And by the way, I did a clinical trial with a team of physicians up in Danbury Hospital, and talking about skeptics and talking about people who have been trained not to take care of themselves. And the whole thing was about burnout. So what I had to do is teach them self-care through self-love. And after they kind of got over that it's okay, the word self-love is okay, and it's okay to love themselves, uh, 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 we had surprisingly promising results with the clinical trial. Ended December 2017. But here is the piece of it that I gave them. Think of nourishment, and we realize it's cyclical in nature. What do I mean by that? If I said to you, Serge, take a breath because you need oxygen. Now take another breath, but don't breathe out. Just take another breath because you need oxygen. And then I said to you, okay, now take another breath because you need oxygen, but don't breathe out. And of course, after a couple of breaths, people start laughing. They can't hold their breath because we need to exhale. Same thing with food. You need food, so let's just keep giving you food, make sure we're nourishing you, but we're not going to allow you to expel. And you're going to die. Same thing with water. And if we think about love, how important it is to give it, when we withhold love from people because we're upset with them, it's like holding our breath. It's almost more painful than not getting love. So people get dogs and flowers, and they scrub their car 58 times, they wax it. We have a need to love. So one of the things I teach people is that the only thing you can control is loving yourself, and you can love other people. They cannot stop you. They may not want it, but that's their problem. You can still be loving. And it's so funny that in some of the relationships, when people begin to be loving where it's not expected, people actually get angry with them because they realize they don't deserve, that's what is going on. I was just an a-hole or whatever, and now you're being loving. So yeah, love is cyclical in nature, and that's kind of the final proof I will point to, that love in fact is nourishment, like air, food, and water. In our system, it behaves exactly like air, food, and water.